Radon might not be a brand you know a lot about, but their recent signing with Manon Carpenter show that they obviously have big intentions for 2017. Which brings us onto the Radon Swoop 170 8.0, which is in fact MBUK's Bike of the Year. Now, if you don't know, Radon are a German brand that sell direct and have a whole host of bikes, everything from e-bikes, cross bikes, road bikes to downhill bikes, including the Swoop lineup. So the 8.0 that we have is the second cheapest bike in a 5-bike lineup. That's not to say it's by any means got a bad spec or anything like that. In fact, it's absolutely phenomenal. The fork is in fact the all-singing, all-dancing Lyric RCT3 from RockShox. Obviously you still get the same solo air spring as you get on the RC fork, and you can still add your bottomless tokens to change the spring curve and make it more progressive. At the rear we've got the RockShox Vivid R2C rear shock. Now this is a bit more downhill orientated than you might expect. Again though, you've got 2 rebound adjustments, beginning and end stroke, and you've also got a low speed compression adjustment. So it's quite easy to actually get this shock tailored exactly how you want it to feel. Wheels come courtesy of DT Swiss in the shape of the E1900 splines. That means they've got a 25mm internal width, which by today's standards isn't as broad or wide as you could potentially go, but still gives the tyres a decent enough shape and supports them well enough when you are really motoring. The tyres though, they're Fat Alberts front and rear. The casing's quite light, so they're not particularly heavy, which is a great thing, but you do need to add a little bit extra pressure to keep the shape of the tyre, keep them supported. The tread seems to work relatively well in most conditions. The main issue we had was that lighter casing, where we found that the bike was so capable we could push it really, really hard, and the tyres just couldn't handle it. Even though they come set up tubeless, we still managed to slash the rear tyre relatively early on in testing, to the point that we couldn't actually repair it, so we had to replace the tyre in the end, which is a shame. While we're getting used to seeing SRAM transmissions and brakes on most of the bikes around this sort of price and in this category, Radon have actually gone and used Magura Mp5 Brakes. Now these use 4 pistons in each caliper, which are incredibly powerful. Thankfully you can modulate that power easy enough, and the brakes don't actually feel too wooden or punchy. The transmission's taken care of by SRAM in the form of their GX 1x11 system. Again, you've got a nice wide range cassette, a 30-tooth chainring, so it's more than easy enough to get up the worst climbs. Other spec highlights include the race face turbine, bar and stem, as well as a lovely RockShox Reverb stealth dropper post. So considering the price, this spec is fantastic, but obviously a fantastic spec doesn't mean anything if the bike doesn't ride well. Thankfully, the Swoop doesn't disappoint. It seems Radon have really hit the nail on the head with the Swoop's geometry. In fact, it's actually got 3 totally usable geometry settings, which range from the very slack to the not quite so slack. To change between the geometry settings, you basically have to just unbolt the 2 triangular chips that sit either side of the lower shock mount and rotate them into the frame. It's a little bit fiddly, but you can still do it on the trail side if you really need to. Regardless, what it means is you've got a super slack setting, which is phenomenal for downhill, but even in that setting, you've still got a relatively steep seat angle. And I mean, I'm not talking super steep like a Geometron or a Pole, but still within the region that the bike is more than happy to pedal up relatively steep climbs without it feeling completely uncomfortable or you being sat right over the rear axle. It was the slack setting that I spent most of the time about. Now, in this setting, the bike's geometry is really, really dialed. That means you've got a bottom bracket height of just over 330mm, but you also have a BB drop of nearly 21mm, which means you're properly sat into the bike and extremely low. So when it comes to cornering, this thing feels flat out fast, really stable and really, really confident, which is exactly what you want from a bike like this. It also has a 64-degree head angle in this setting, and the seat angle sits around 75 degrees, so still pretty steep, more than capable on the climbs. Obviously those slack angles are all good and well, but if the proportions aren't quite right, then they're no good to anyone. Thankfully though, the Swoop's reach is actually really quite decent. At 460mm on our 18-inch test bike, although we did want the 20-inch bike, it wasn't available at the time. 460mm for a rider, especially of my height at 5'8", felt absolutely spot on. Now I know I've banged on a lot about suspension balance in the past, and again, the Radon is particularly good at this. So front to rear, especially the fact you can dial in both low speed on the shock and on the fork, means I managed to get the bike feeling really, really well balanced. This meant that on the trail, things were well supported when I needed them to be, and forgiving enough when it got really, really ugly. So long route spreads or huge rocky bouldered sections felt like I could just hammer through, but I still felt like I could really feel what was going on beneath the tyre. On really loose, flat, rocky turns where you're sometimes scrubbing around for traction, the Swoop really comes into its own. Not only does the geometry and that low bottom bracket make things feel really confident, there's that supple initial stroke on the suspension, which just lets the tyres track the ground really, really well, alongside the fact that both the fork and shock are incredibly supple at the start of the stroke. That means you get as much traction out the tyres as you possibly can, and things feel nicely predictable even when you think it's going to get out of shape. The big thing for me with the Swoop is that it does a lot of things really well. Get it onto a steep, rocky downhill, and you've got the confidence in the angles on the suspension that you can really open it up and let it go. Equally, on mellower trails that require a bit more movement on the bike, it still feels really lively and fun to ride. You can chuck it between turns, you can pop it off jumps, and it still feels incredibly fun. It doesn't sap any of the energy as you're working the bike through sections, and ultimately it's still lively enough that you can have plenty of fun on it. And though 170mm travel sounds like a lot, it actually pedals surprisingly well. Okay, there's no climb switch on the shock, but that lack of efficiency is more than made up for the fact you can fine-tune that rear shock with that low-speed compression dial. Besides that, our only other real criticism is maybe the tyres, but again, replace those and considering the price and the overall package, this bike is really hard to fault. The MBUK Bike of the Year was obviously an extremely hard-fought battle between 20 really good bikes. And for Radon to come out on top with the Swoop 170 is an amazing feat for those guys. In fact, it's going to be a really tough bike to beat in 2018.